The automated welcome beacon was the first thing they heard when the cryo units cracked open. It played on a loop, a recorded voice, warm and professional, the kind of voice engineered to make humans feel safe in the dark, and it said, "Welcome back to active status, crew of the Ardennes. Current ship time is 0600. Orbital insertion in 42 hours. You are home." Nora Baxter heard it through the fog of re-emergence, when her body was still deciding whether it remembered how to be a body. She tasted copper and recycled air, and the faint chemical sweetness of the cryobath draining off her skin. The ceiling of her pod was beaded with condensation. She stared up at it, and breathed, just breathed, counting the seconds the way the medics had trained her to do. 1, 2, 3. Letting the autonomic functions re-establish themselves before she tried anything ambitious like moving. Around her, the unit bay was filling with small sounds, the hydraulic sigh of other pods cycling open, the wet gasp of a person dragging their first real breath in 14 months, someone retching distantly, which was normal. Cryo re-emergence did things to the inner ear. "Baxter." The voice was low, hoarse, barely a voice at all. "You alive?" She turned her head. In the adjacent pod, Michael Stallworth was sitting up with the slow carefulness of a man who expected the floor to disagree with him. His face was gaunt in the way cryo always left you. All the subcutaneous fat redistributed and slow to return, but his eyes were the same. Dark, watchful, already working the room. "Alive," she said, "mostly." "Danny?" She craned her neck. The third pod in their unit cluster was already open, empty. The interior light was still blinking its active cycle pulse, which meant the occupant had egressed recently. Nora felt a small loosening in her chest. 14 months of nothing. 14 months of sealed dark and the soft algorithmic hum of life support. And now the first thing she needed to know was that the people she'd gone under with had come back up. "He's up already," Michael said. He was on his feet now, moving with careful deliberateness toward the equipment locker. "Of course he is. Can't miss a meal. The man runs on anxiety and protein bars. Let him have it." They found Danny Turner in the crew mess, which was 3 modules forward and smelled of reconstituted coffee, and he was sitting at the long table with his elbows on the surface and his face in his hands. He didn't hear them come in. He was just sitting there in the early silence of re-emergence with his shoulders slightly hunched, doing the thing Nora had learned to recognize over 6 years of working alongside him. The private accounting, the internal audit of whatever had gone wrong while he was sleeping. With Danny, there was always something. "Hey," she said, not loudly. He looked up. He had that stripped-down, raw nerve quality that re-emergence put on everyone, but on Danny it looked sharper. His eyes were red at the edges. He'd been crying or close to it. "Sorry," he said. It's a lot coming back." "Yeah," Nora said, "it is." She sat down across from him. Michael took the corner seat and reached for the coffee carafe without ceremony, which was very Michael. The man had an allergic reaction to emotional air, filled it with practical action. He poured 3 cups. Nobody said anything for a moment, and in that silence the welcome beacon played on its loop somewhere in the wall. "Welcome back! Welcome back!" And the ship breathed around them. They were 14 months out from the Kepler 442 survey. 14 months since the Ardennes had departed the station at Callisto carrying its crew of 11 on what was supposed to be a 6-week observation run, only to have its drive motivator fracture on approach and leave them limping in an elliptical decay orbit for over a year, while a rescue tender was dispatched and turned back twice by solar weather. And finally they'd been brought around on a corrected burn and aimed home with enough fuel for insertion and not much else. 14 months. 11 crew, the cryomanifest said. 11 crew. "I keep thinking about the years," Danny said. He was turning his coffee cup in his hands, not drinking it. "You know how cryo doesn't feel like time passing, but it is time. You just weren't in it. And I keep thinking everything we were worrying about before we went under. All that stuff that felt so important, whatever it was. It's been a year for everything else. Just not for us." "That's a lot of philosophy for 0615, Michael said. "Michael, I'm not wrong." Danny smiled, just barely. The smile made him look like himself again. Younger, the wry edge that had gotten him through 6 years of deep space survey work, intact when some better funded, better rested people had not. Nora felt something loosen in her chest again. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed to see that smile. They had coffee. They talked about nothing for a while, the deliberately lightweight conversation of people remembering how to be in the same room, and outside the mess porthole the stars were doing what stars did in deep space. Nothing, brilliantly, in enormous quantities. And the Ardennes moved through them at a comfortable 1/8 light, bleeding velocity for insertion. It wasn't until the third hour of their watch rotation that anyone found the growth on the hull. Kowalski reported it during his external maintenance check, his voice on the comms carrying that particular flatness that experienced spacers get when they're looking at something they've decided not to panic about yet. "Baxter," he said, "you're going to want to see this. Bring Turner if he's up. The geologist eye will be useful." The growth was on the outer surface of Module 7, the rearmost cargo section, and Nora saw it first through the observation port before she suited up. A cluster of shapes that she initially took for impact damage, some kind of structural foam extruding from a microfracture. Then her eyes adjusted to the angle of the running lights, and she understood it was the wrong color for that, the wrong texture, and far too regular. They were ovoid, pale and slightly luminescent, each one roughly the size of a human head, growing in an asymmetric cluster that covered perhaps 3 square meters of hull surface. They had the unmistakable quality of things that were alive. "When did those appear?" she asked. "Not on the pre-cryo inspection," Kowalski said. He was suited up already, magnetized boots locked to the external catwalk, leaning in for a closer look. "I checked every centimeter of that section before we went under. There was nothing." 14 months, Danny said beside her. He was studying them through the port with an expression she recognized. The particular focused intensity of a man who had spent his career cataloging alien geology and was now looking at something that was neither familiar nor categorizable. Something must have attached during the drift period. Something from the survey region. "That's 400 million kilometers of something," Michael said. "Things drift. Ejecta, spore bodies, interplanetary debris. You know this. I know it doesn't usually grow on my ship." Nora watched Kowalski reach out toward the nearest growth. There was a procedure for unidentified biological contact, full isolation protocol, sample containment, comms to the station's Zenobio desk. She knew the procedure. She opened her mouth. "Kowalski don't." But Kowalski was a man who had been in space for 22 years and had developed the engineer's particular brand of physical familiarity with hardware, the instinct that said a thing was not truly understood until you put your hand on it. His gloved finger touched the surface of the nearest ovoid. The growth pulsed. It was barely visible, a single contraction, like a heartbeat, like something deep inside it responding to pressure. And from the tip of the ovoid, a filament extended, moving with eerie speed, and found the seam at Kowalski's wrist where the glove met the suit's sleeve. And before anyone on the observation side could do more than inhale, it had pressed itself into that seam and retracted. "Christ," Kowalski said. "Something." He looked at his wrist. "Something stung me." The seam looked intact. His suit pressure was holding. But he pulled his hand back, and they could see through the port that his glove was already developing a faint discoloration at the contact point, a bruised purple spreading through the polymer at a speed that was not consistent with anything chemical Nora could name. "Get inside," she said now. Kowalski's wrist, when they got the suit off him in the medbay, was swollen to nearly twice its normal circumference. The tissue was hot and tight, the skin stretched and mottled with something that traveled in the veins. They could see it, faintly, a dark tracery moving upward from the point of contact like a root system finding water. It was not painful, Kowalski said, which was more frightening than if it had been. "I've been stung by worse," he told them. He seemed genuinely unconcerned, which Nora clocked and filed away as something to think about later. "Reactor coolant splash, maintenance fluid burns. This barely registers." "It's moving," Danny said quietly. They all looked. The dark tracery was in his forearm now. Moving slowly but measurably, finding the paths of least resistance through the tissue. And as they watched it branched, sending a thin tendril toward the inside of the elbow. "We need to contain you," Nora said. "Nora Kowalski, I'm not asking." She said it the way she'd learned to say things in 6 years of survey command. Not loudly, not with the hard edge that made people defensive, just with the full weight of her intention behind it, flat and final as a pressure seal engaging. Kowalski looked at her for a moment, and she watched him process it, and then he nodded. They put him in the isolation cabin adjacent to the med bay, and Nora posted a watch rotation. She calmed the station with a full biological contact report. She did everything right. She did it all within the first hour, by the book, and none of it mattered. 'Cause Kowalski was quiet for the rest of that cycle, and when she checked on him at the end of the first watch, he was sleeping, and his breathing was normal, and the tracery had faded. When she put the scanner on him, it showed nothing anomalous. By the third check, he was asking for food, and his wrist looked almost normal, and he said he felt fine. He said he felt fine. She let herself be relieved. She shouldn't have let herself be relieved. The first sign was subtle enough that she almost missed it entirely. They were 28 hours from insertion, close enough that the station's orbit was a visible point of light in the forward porthole, close enough to feel like almost home. And Kolsolsky had been released from isolation and returned to his maintenance rotation because his vitals were clean. And the Zenobio consultant at the station had calmed back to say the filament contact was consistent with known interplanetary spore body defense mechanisms, and that it was almost certainly inert once the initial contact phase was complete. Almost certainly. Kowalski was in the engine compartment running his post-cryo calibrations when Danny came to find Nora in the navigation bay. She knew something was wrong before he spoke. She knew it the way you know things about people you've worked alongside for years. A shift in the quality of his silence, something too precise in the way he positioned himself in the hatchway. He wants to go back, Danny said. Who? Kowalski. He told me during the calibration check. He said he thinks we should alter course. Go back to the survey region. Nora set down the chart overlay she'd been working with. Why? He said there were things out there worth studying, that what attached to the hull was significant, that we were abandoning something important. Danny paused. He said it like he was reading it off a card. She looked at him. What does that mean? I mean, his voice it was Kowalski's voice. His cadence, his phrasing, everything. But there was no, Nora, you know how Kowalski talks about his calibration runs? Like they're a minor holy war? He's been arguing about the timing on those injectors since we left Callisto. He cares deeply about that. He talks about it with this sort of simmering outrage. Danny spread his hands. He told me about the course change the way someone reads an announcement. Not like it was his idea. Like it was a fact he was transmitting. The hum of the ship surrounded them. The welcome beacon was still playing somewhere. Its loop shortened now that they were close enough to the station to receive its own signal traffic. Overlapping, the recorded warmth of the Ardennes automation undercut by the faint carrier noise of real human communication. I'll talk to him, Nora said. Nora, his wrist. She stopped. I saw it when he was checking the injector housing. The tracery is back, not faded, not inert. Danny held her gaze. It's in his neck. She found Kowalski in the engine compartment, and she stood in the hatchway and watched him for a full 30 seconds before he registered her presence, and in that 30 seconds she watched him work. He was running the calibrations with his usual precision. His movements were correct. His hands were steady. Every observable thing about him was Kowalski, but he moved without commentary. He didn't mutter at the housing when it resisted. He didn't check his work twice with the particular skeptical squint of a man who trusted the readings, but not the instruments. He just moved through the tasks with a smooth, unbothered efficiency that was deeply, specifically wrong, the way an actor who knows all the words might still miss the music. Kowalski, she said. He looked up. His face was neutral. Commander, I was going to come find you. I think we should discuss our approach vector. Does your wrist hurt? A beat. Brief, nearly imperceptible, the kind of pause that meant a system retrieving a file. No, I'm fine. Let me see it. Nora Kowalski. The flat, final voice. The pressure seal voice. Let me see your wrist. He held it out. The tracery was gone from the wrist. It had moved, she realized. Moved upward, moved inward, and what she was looking at was just skin, normal skin. But the tendon in his forearm moved incorrectly when she turned his wrist, the way a puppet moves when the strings are slightly misaligned. She released his hand and took 2 steps back. I'm fine, he said again. His voice was careful. His eyes were Kowalski's eyes, the right color, the right set. But there was something behind them that did not have 14 months of drift orbit fatigue in it. Something that was looking at her with an attention that was too steady and too wide. Okay, she said, thank you. She turned and walked back to the navigation bay, and she didn't run, and she didn't let her breathing change until the hatch was sealed behind her. She pulled Michael and Danny into the small equipment bay adjacent to navigation, the most isolated habitable space on the ship. No internal cameras, walls thick enough to attenuate sound. And she told them what she'd seen. Michael processed it the way Michael processed things. 3 seconds of stillness, then movement, then action planning. Who else has had contact with him since he was released from isolation? I don't know. Potentially most of the crew. We need to pull the contact logs. We need to do it without alerting. She hesitated. Whatever is using him. Because that was what she was working with now. Not a sick man, not a contaminated colleague. Something that had found a man, and was wearing him, and was doing it well enough to pass a medical scan and a conversation with the station's Zenobio desk. and 2 watch rotations with his crewmates. Something patient enough and intelligent enough to not break character until it felt safe. And the only reason it had broken, the only reason Danny had noticed, was that Danny knew Kowalski well enough to hear the silence where his personality used to be. That was the thing. That was the fragile, human, almost embarrassing thing that had cracked it open. Not scanners, not protocols, not the Zenobio procedure she'd executed by the book. The 14 years of watching a man argue about injector timing. The particular music of how someone you know talks about the things they love. "We have 11 crew," she said. "I need to talk to each of them, personally. And I need to know if there's anyone else who has changed." "How do we test for it without them knowing we're testing?" Michael asked. "We don't test. We talk." She looked at him. "We ask them about things they love, things they've been angry about, things they've been looking forward to. You can train something to answer questions correctly. You can't train it to miss the things the real person would miss." Danny was very quiet. He was looking at his own hands, the good dark skin of them, turning them over once as if conducting a brief private inspection. "Danny," she said. "I'm thinking about Kowalski's daughter," he said. "He showed me a picture before we went under. She was wearing this Halloween costume. She was maybe 4. She was a dinosaur or something. One of those foam suits, and he was just completely undone by it. He kept saying, 'Look at her. Look at her face. She's furious at the costume.' And I was laughing and thinking, 'God, I don't have anything like that, and I don't know if I want it.' And I was a little sad about it. And he didn't even notice because he was so busy being absolutely wrecked over this dinosaur toddler." He paused. "Whatever is in him now, it doesn't know about that picture." "No," Nora said, "it doesn't, so we use that. We use what it can't know." They moved through the crew methodically over the next 4 hours. Nora and Michael and Danny splitting the ship into sectors and finding reasons to have natural conversations. Equipment checks, meal rotation, the approaching insertion protocol that genuinely required everyone's attention. And in those conversations, they asked the ordinary questions. The ones that sounded like nothing. "How's your shoulder? Didn't you have that thing you wanted to do when you got back? What did you decide about your mother's place?" And they listened. The listening was the hard part. Not because it was difficult to hear, because it required a kind of attention that Nora associated with grief, the hyper-clarity of noticing someone for what might be the last time, cataloging the specific quality of their presence so that the catalog would outlast whatever came next. She had done this before, watching a colleague go into a difficult EVA, watching a crew member board an emergency tender, the way perception sharpened around people in the moment before they became uncertain. This was the same sensation. She was looking at each person as if to memorize them. Michael ran his checks in the forward engineering bay, where 2 of the crew had been working their post-Creo systems review. He asked about Yamamoto's upcoming transfer to the Titan survey rotation. Yamamoto had been talking about it for months, had opinions about every aspect of it, had a particular excitement about the geological surveys that gave his voice a specific texture when he talked about it. Yamamoto answered the question correctly, including facts, but the texture was wrong. Nora, monitoring on a sidecomms channel, heard Michael's pause, brief, inaudible, before he moved the conversation elsewhere. That made 5. She handled the remaining crew herself. Ito, Reyes, and Okoro passed within the first exchange. Ito by launching unprompted into a complaint about the mess rota that was so specifically aggravating, and so specific to Ito that no system could have generated it. Reyes by asking Nora 3 separate questions about the insertion protocol that she'd been asking variations of since her second posting. Okoro by the way she laughed at something on her screen before Nora had even spoken. The private amusement of a person alone, that genuinely funny to them. 3 more crew members had failed. Not obviously, not with the flat-eyed blankness Nora had first seen in Kowalski. Whatever was moving through it had learned something in the hours since Kowalski's exposure, had refined its performance. And the 3 new ones, Chen, Park, and Vasquez, were better. They answered questions correctly. They had surface-level, emotional responses. Chen even laughed at Michael's joke about the insertion window. A real-sounding laugh, the right pitch and duration. But Chen had a sister in Buenos Aires, who she sent voice messages to every single day of every posting. Messages that ran anywhere from 40 seconds to 20 minutes. Messages about her sister's kids and her sister's garden, and the ongoing saga of a neighborhood dispute that had been running since their childhood. She talked about her sister the way some people talk about religion, not consciously, not as a subject, but as the thing everything else was organized around. When Michael asked how Maria was doing, casual offhand, the way you ask about someone you've heard mentioned 100 times, Chen said she was fine, that Maria was fine. In exactly 2 sentences. The dispute was not mentioned. The garden was not mentioned. The children's names, which Nora had heard more times than she could count, were not mentioned. Park had a specific and detailed hatred of the re-entry sequence on the Ardennes, which he described as feeling like being slowly crushed inside a vibrating filing cabinet, which he had described in exactly those words to at least 3 separate people on at least 4 separate occasions, which he had described to Nora herself twice in the last 6 weeks before cryo. When Danny mentioned the upcoming insertion, asking how he was feeling about the deceleration burn, Park said it would be fine. He even added that it wasn't so bad. His face was entirely relaxed. He looked like a man who had never held a strong opinion about anything. Vasquez had been planning, for the entire 14 months before they went under, to propose to her partner when they got back. She had shown Danny the ring over dinner 3 nights before cryo, a simple band she'd made from an iron meteorite she'd found on the Ceres survey, and she'd so obviously terrified and so obviously delighted about it that Danny had said it was the best thing he'd seen on any posting. She'd left the ring in Danny's keeping while she was under. Jokingly, she said, so she couldn't change her mind. When Nora sat with her in the mess and talked about what she was most looking forward to, Vasquez said she was looking forward to some rest. She said it like it was the truest thing she knew. 6 crew. Out of 11 that left 5, Nora, Michael, Danny, and Ito, and Reyes and Okoro, the 3 who'd passed, and Yamamoto unconfirmed, which Danny was still working. 5 against 6 on a ship where everything they needed was also a vector. That left 7, Nora, Michael, Danny, and 4 others. 7 against 4, on a ship where everything they needed to survive was also a tool that could be turned against them. Nora told the others at 0200. In the equipment bay, speaking quietly enough that the hum of the ventilation was louder than her voice. She told them what she'd found, and what she thought it meant, and what she intended to do about it. She watched their faces while she talked. The real ones. The ones with the ordinary mess of feelings in them. Alarm and disbelief, and the particular human stubbornness of people who have been given bad information and are resisting it even as they accept it. Okoro pressed a fist to her mouth at some point and held it there. Ito's face did not change, but she went very still. Reyes looked at the floor. Nora herself resisted it even as she accepted it. That was the thing she'd learned in 6 years of survey command. You didn't get to choose what you were dealing with. You only got to choose what you did with it. We have 22 hours to insertion, she said. The station is expecting 11 crew. If we arrive with a compromised crew and no warning, whatever this is gets a foothold in a populated facility. She paused. I'm not willing to let that happen. What's the alternative? Ito asked. She had 20 years in, and a face that didn't rearrange itself when things got difficult, and she was asking the question with the tone of someone who already knew the answer and needed to hear it, said aloud before she could agree to it. We can't turn back. We don't have the fuel. We don't need to turn back. We need to stop the spread, and we need to send the station a credible warning before we arrive. Nora looked around the bay. The growth is on Module 7. The 6 crew we've confirmed are infected were all in the aft section during the first 4 hours after Kowalski's release. I think transmission is proximity-based. The organism spreads through the air in the immediate vicinity of an infected host, close range, probably requiring extended contact. It needs to be close to transfer. How close? Michael asked. Close enough for a conversation. The silence that followed was the specific kind that comes when a room full of people simultaneously does the same calculation and arrives at the same uncomfortable place. Separate the ship, Danny said. Seal the aft section. Contain the 6 of them back there. That's the plan. But we need to move them there first. Or rather, we need to move them without them understanding what we're doing until it's done. The insertion pre-check protocol does that naturally. There are legitimate reasons for every member of the aft team to be in the aft section right now. We just make sure the reasons happen in sequence. And then we seal the hatch, Reyes said. She said it flatly, and Nora heard the weight in it. Reyes and Vasquez had been close. Had been. The past tense was going to take time. And then we seal the hatch, Nora confirmed. And we send the beacon and we wait. How long do we have before they figure it out? Ito asked. The thing using Kowalski wanted to reroute us back to the survey region. It made one attempt with him, and when I didn't engage it went quiet. It's been quiet for 6 hours, she paused. That means it's smart enough to know that pushing too hard would trigger exactly this response. It knows we're watching, or it suspects. It's waiting to see what we do. So it's watching us watch it, Michael said, which is why we behave normally for the next 2 hours and then use the protocol as cover. She looked around at the 5 of them. We've been doing the right things all night. We keep doing them. We don't change anything that would signal a change in approach. Then we move, Ida said. Then we move. The plan was simple in its outlines and brutal in its execution. They would use the approaching insertion protocol, which genuinely required the aft crew to run engine checks and life support calibrations to separate the ship along the natural division between forward and aft sections. The aft hatch seal was rated for hard vacuum and could be locked from the forward side with a manual override that could not be remotely bypassed. Once the seal was engaged, Nora would broadcast to the station on a tight encrypted beam, request a Zenobio containment response on arrival, and spend the remaining 20 hours holding the line. What made it brutal was that she would have to look Kowalski in the face and give him his assignment and watch him walk aft, and she would know what she was doing. And whatever was looking out through his eyes might know it too. She found him at 0300, in the corridor outside the navigation bay, as if he'd been waiting. Something in the positioning of it, slightly too precisely centered in the corridor, slightly too much eye contact, told her that it knew. Not everything, not the specifics, but enough to know that she knew, and that they were in the part of this now where the pretense was wearing thin. "Commander," it said with Kowalski's voice. "I need you in the aft section," she said. "Pre-insertion life support check. You know the sequence better than anyone." It held its stillness for 1 second too long. "Of course," it said. "I'll get started now." It walked past her. She tracked it in her peripheral vision without turning, listening to the magnetic footfalls receding down the corridor. And her hands were very steady, and she was thinking about Kowalski's daughter in the dinosaur suit, furious at the foam, and she was thinking about the picture he'd shown Danny before they went under. And she was thinking, he is still in there somewhere. He has to be. The thing needed a functioning host, and Kowalski was the most technically capable person on the ship, and you didn't discard something you were using. You co-opted it. You wore it. He was still in there. She held that. She gave it 40 minutes and then she sealed the hatch. The manual override was a lever behind a safety cover in the navigation bay. She'd briefed Michael and Danny on the sequence. She pulled the cover, set her hand on the lever, and looked through the porthole at the aft corridor. Kowalski was standing in the corridor, just standing there equidistant from the hatch and the aft bulkhead, and he was looking at her through the porthole with Kowalski's face. And for one terrible second, she saw Kowalski's face actually be Kowalski's face. The slight furrow between the brows that meant he'd worked something out and wasn't happy about it. The set of his mouth that meant he understood a situation and was dignifying it with his attention. Not the puppet. Him. "Nora," he said. His voice was muffled through the seal, but she could hear it barely. She pulled the lever. The hatch sealed with a hydraulic thunk that she felt through her feet, through the floor, through the ship's bones, and the porthole showed her Kowalski standing in a locked corridor and the lights on the seal status board going red. She let herself breathe. Then she let herself feel it. She had sealed 6 people into the aft section. 6 people she had eaten meals with and argued over shift schedules with and trusted with her life at various distances over the course of 6 years. She had looked at Kowalski through a porthole and pulled a lever and felt the hydraulic resistance of it. The lever required pressure, genuine physical pressure, the kind that made her forearm work. And that physical effort had been what she'd focused on in the moment, the deliberate mechanics of it, because the alternative was to be fully present to what the act meant. She was present to it now. She sat down on the floor of the navigation bay, which she had not done in the 6 years she'd held command, because commanders didn't sit on floors. And she put her back against the base of the comms board and looked at the ceiling and let the weight of the last 8 hours arrive. It arrived the way weight always does. Not all at once, but in waves, each one a slightly different frequency. The look on Kowalski's face in that 30 seconds before he'd registered her watching him, when he'd just been moving through the calibrations. The specific absence in it. The way a room feels different when someone's taken all the warmth out. Chen saying Maria was fine in 2 sentences. Maria who took up so much space in Chen's life that there'd been something like light around her when she talked about her. Vasquez saying she was looking forward to some rest. She thought about the organism in the dark of the aft section, behind the seal, wearing 6 people it didn't understand. She thought about it with something that was not quite pity and not quite contempt, but had elements of both. The recognition of something that was doing the best it could with the tools it had, and the cold understanding that its best was catastrophic. It had crossed 400 million kilometers and found 11 people at their most vulnerable, cryo-depleted, isolated, deep in the kind of interpersonal friction that a 14-month drift orbit generates. And it had moved through them with patience and intelligence and total incomprehension, and it still didn't know what it was missing. Couldn't know. The worn places were exactly the places it couldn't perceive. She thought this was probably its largest strategic failure, and also the saddest thing she could imagine. Then she got up off the floor. She smoothed her flight suit, which didn't need smoothing, and she pulled up the comms panel and she started composing the Zenobio beacon, and the welcome message was still playing on its loop somewhere in the ship's bones. Welcome back. Welcome back. You are home. And she worked. Michael found her 20 minutes later and didn't ask why she was sitting on the floor. Because she wasn't sitting on the floor anymore, and what she was working, and Michael understood working the way he understood everything, as the correct response to almost any situation. Beacon drafted, he asked. Sending now. Good, he looked at the status board. The seal light was still red. You okay? I pulled the lever, she said. Yeah, I'm okay. She looked at him. I will be. He nodded. He pulled a chair up to the adjacent panel and started running the insertion calculations that needed to be run regardless of everything, because the ship still had to park, and the math still had to work, and that was the job. She let herself be grateful for that, for the job, and for Michael, and for the math that still needed to work. Then she went back to the beacon. Danny came in a few minutes later and poured 2 cups of coffee from the carafe that was somehow still half full, and set them on the table, and the 3 of them sat in the navigation bay, with the approaching light of the station growing incrementally brighter in the forward porthole, and they didn't say a lot. There wasn't a lot to say. What mattered now was the hours, and the hands on the levers, and the question of whether whatever lived behind Kowalski's eyes was patient enough to wait 20 hours, or desperate enough to find another way through. You know what I keep thinking about, Danny said, eventually. Tell me, Nora said. Back home. Before we shipped out, before any of this, my mother used to hum when she cooked. This one specific melody I could never identify. I asked her once what it was, and she said she didn't know. It was just what came out of her hands when she worked. He paused. I think that's the thing. The thing that none of this can fake. Whatever is in Kowalski, whatever it's been watching and recording and copying, it can get his voice right, and it can get his eyes right, and it can almost get his movements right. But it doesn't have anything it hums when it's not paying attention to itself. You know what I mean? There's no underneath. There's no just being. Nora turned that over. Is that what you think the difference is? I think that's what the difference always is. Not the big obvious things. The small things that don't have a reason. He looked at his coffee. The thing in the woods, whatever built those pods. It's been doing this for a long time. It's very good at people. But it's good at people the way a very good copy is good at the original. All the features, none of the worn places. The places where the thing just is what it is because nothing else is there. Nora thought about this. Outside, the stars were doing what stars did. The station was growing in the porthole. The worn places, she said. Yeah. That's why it wants to go back, she said. It doesn't want to be here. It doesn't want to be among people who know the originals well enough to see the difference. Out there, it would just be colonizing something new. Here it has to pass. And it can't pass forever. No, she said. It can't. 14 hours into the seal, the aft comms board lit up. Kowalski's voice. Or what was using his voice. Nora. A pause. You should know that this is reversible. She'd expected contact. She'd been sitting with it in the back of her mind for the full 14 hours. The question of what it would say when it decided to speak. She keyed the comms. Tell me. The organism is adaptive. It can reverse the integration process. What was taken can be returned. Another pause. The host is intact. Kowalski is intact. All 4 of them are intact. They are resting. They will remember very little. Nora said nothing. You don't need to fear this, the voice continued. This is not what you're imagining. The organism doesn't consume. It coexists. It uses the host's capabilities to propagate and sustain itself, but it does not damage what it uses. A pause. You're a survey commander. You understand what it is to use a resource carefully. She thought about this genuinely. She let herself actually think about it. Because the thing about a very old, very patient intelligence, and she was certain now that it was old, older than anything she'd cataloged in 6 years of survey work, older maybe than the sun, was that it would not be stupid. It would know the shape of a winning argument. It would know how to construct one. It was also, she reflected, in a locked aft section with no way forward and 20 hours until she could hand it to people with better tools than she had. I understand resource management, she said. Then understand this. We have been traveling between systems for longer than your species has been building tools. We are everywhere you will ever go. The integration we offer is not a threat. It is an inevitability. The only question is whether your people receive it with us as partners or adversaries. She waited. Let it feel like it had landed. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes. Does Kowalski know about his daughter's Halloween costume? A pause, longer than the others. The kind of pause that meant a system retrieving a file and not finding it. Tell me about the dinosaur, she said. If you have everything of his, tell me about the costume. Tell me what he felt. Silence. Tell me what it was like to be completely undone by a 4-year-old in a foam suit who was furious about the hat. The silence stretched. Behind her, she heard Michael make a small sound. Not a laugh exactly. The precursor to one. You don't have that, she said. You have his hands and his voice and his maintenance protocols. You have everything he knew, maybe. But you don't have the part that doesn't have a reason. You don't have the part that just was. She let that settle. That's what you're asking me to give up. Not just the people I can name. Every piece of everyone that doesn't have a reason. All the worn places. The comms were silent. We're not partners, she said. We're not adversaries. You're a thing I found on my hull. And in 20 hours I'm going to hand you to people who are going to spend a very long time trying to understand what you are. That's the most honest thing I can offer you. She clicked off the comms. She sat back. Danny was looking at her. Michael was looking at her. It can't hear us off comms? Danny asked. Not through this seal. The acoustic baffling is rated for total isolation. Good, Michael said. He reached for the carafe. Because I really didn't want it to hear me say that was the most terrifying thing I've ever heard in my life and also the most. He stopped. What's the word? Correct, Danny said. The word is correct. They were 8 hours out when the station's response team acknowledged receipt of her beacon and came back with a docking protocol. Separate umbilical for the aft section, Zenobio containment crew in full isolation suits, a 4-staged decontamination before any of the aft crew would be brought aboard. Everything she'd asked for and a few things she hadn't thought to ask for. She sat with the acknowledgement on the screen for a while. They'll be okay? Danny asked. That's what the Zenobio team is for. She kept her voice level. And if it told the truth about reversibility, do you believe it? She thought about it. I believe it doesn't have any reason to lie about that particular thing. Killing the hosts would make it easier to handle, not harder. She paused. It's old and it's patient and it's been moving between systems for longer than we've been building tools. It would know that the best leverage is an intact host. The best chance of propagating is a living person walking out that hatch. So it's in everyone's interest for Kowalski to be okay. In the short term, Danny nodded. He was quiet for a moment. In the picture, he said. The one Kowalski showed me, his daughter, she really was furious about the hat. It was this little dinosaur hat that was a part of the suit, and she'd grabbed it and was holding it like she was going to throw it, and Kowalski was just. You could hear it in his voice when he told me, like the universe had done something exactly right. Nora said nothing. Just let that sit in the air for a while. In the navigation bay, on the ship that was breathing around them, heading home. I'm going to tell him, Danny. When he comes back, I'm going to tell him I know about the hat. Yes, Nora said. So he knows what I was holding on to. Yes, she said. That's a good thing to hold on to. The station filled the porthole like a small sun, its running lights and docking arrays and the slow, patient geometry of a thing built by people to keep people alive in the cold. The Ardennes matched velocity, bled the last of its approach burn, and moved toward the umbilical lock with the careful institutional grace of a ship that had been doing this a long time. In the aft section, behind the sealed hatch, 4 people slept. Or something slept inside them, or both. Nora thought about Kowalski's hands, which had spent 22 years keeping ships running, the specific competence in them, the trust she had in those hands. She thought about them as a resource, the way the voice had put it, and felt the ugliness of that framing and also the almost unbearable tenderness of the alternative. The hands as his, the hands as belonging to a man who loved an extravagantly furious child, the hands as irreplaceable and mortal and worth the 22-hour vigil. The docking clamps engaged. The station's Zenobio team was on the secondary umbilical within 3 minutes. She could hear them through the hull sensors, the soft authoritative transit of people who knew what they were doing. She kept her hand near the aft seal override, not because she'd need it now, but because it mattered to her that she was still there, still at the lever. 14 months of drift. 4 people behind a sealed hatch. A thing older than human memory pacing in the dark. And Nora Baxter standing at the forward end of the ship with her hand near the lever because that was the job. Michael appeared beside her. "They're on the umbilical," he said. "I know. You can step back." I know. She didn't step back for another 40 seconds. She wanted to be the last thing between whatever was patient and whatever it was patient about. She wanted the weight of those seconds to mean something, even if the meaning was just her, still there, still watching. Then she stepped back. Then she let the station's people do what station's people do. Kowalski was in the medical bay for 11 days. On the 12th day, Nora went to see him. She brought coffee, which he complained about because the station's coffee is categorically inferior to the Ardennes galley, which was a calibration dispute she'd been hearing from him for 6 years, and which hit her somewhere in the chest when she heard it. He looked thinner. There were shadows around his eyes that weren't entirely about the cryodepletion, and his hands had the slightly unfamiliar quality of hands that a person was learning to trust again. But he looked like himself. He had the furrow between his brows and the set of his mouth. And when she sat down across from him, he looked at her with the attention of someone who understood what had happened, and was going to have feelings about it for a long time, and was beginning the hard work of that. "The thing I remember most," he said, "is the quiet. Like everything was still running but someone had turned the urgency off." He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup, and I could see myself doing things, saying things, but I couldn't push on it. Like dreaming where you know it's a dream but you can't make yourself wake up. "Were you afraid?" He thought about it. "I was very far away from my fear. The thing was using everything I needed to be afraid." He paused. "I'm afraid now. In hindsight, that's reasonable." Danny said. He stopped. "Danny said you used my daughter. The Halloween picture." He looked at her. "That's what you. I needed something it didn't have." He was quiet for a moment. Did he describe her? Was she furious, Nora said. Completely furious about the hat. Something moved across Kowalski's face that she didn't have a name for. It was wide and complicated and very specifically him. Not happiness, not relief. Something older and closer to the bone. The worn places. The parts that didn't have a reason. "Yeah," he said. He was looking at the middle distance. Yeah, she really was. Nora drank her inferior station coffee and let him have the moment, and outside the medical bay's porthole the stars were doing what stars always did, which was nothing, brilliantly, in enormous quantities, and the station held its position in the dark as it always had. A light that people had built to keep people alive. And somewhere out in the survey region between here and Kepler 4442 there were pale, luminescent things growing on rocks and ejecta and the frozen surfaces of things without names, and they were patient. But so were the people with the lights on. So was every person who had ever stood at a lever, in the dark, with their hand on the seal, holding the line between what was patient and what was worth protecting. So were they.